sentence are kind of two sides of the same coin. A periodic sentence is when you start your sentence with a bunch of modifying phrases and clauses that ultimately lead up to your main clause or the main idea of the sentence. So you spend the entire sentence waiting to hear what the main idea is. So for example, this quote from Warren, "But if life hardly seems worth living, if liberty is used for subhuman purposes, if the pursuers of happiness know nothing about the nature of their quarry, blah, 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 blah," and then finally the main clause, "these constitutional rights will not be very meaningful." So the main clause, right, "these constitutional rights will not be meaningful," doesn't come until the very last part of the sentence. Everything before that is a series of periodic descriptors that build tension and lead us into the main clause.
Miss Fletcher, really fast. Can you like post this on Canvas, like, because you said these are the specific ones we have to study, right?
Yeah.
Can you post this Quizlet on Canvas if it isn't already?
It is. It's under important resources, and I linked it to each day in this week's module.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Remember that the Quizlet for this class is always on important resources. So anytime you want to like go over terms, it should always be under that module at the very top. So a cumulative sentence is, like I said, the other side of that coin. You start off with the main clause, and then you follow it with a bunch of descriptors or extra information that accumulate over time, sort of like a snowball effect. You're just given more and more details over and over and over again until you finally get to the end of the sentence. Hemingway is an author who did this a lot. He starts with the main clause, and then he just keeps adding detail and description, and almost to the point where you kind of lose the main clause because you are inundated with this accumulation of descriptors, which is why they call it a cumulative sentence. Balanced sentence isn't on there. It's basically parallel structure, so that's the term that we use in this class, is parallel structure. And then the two that I believe we have not visited since that initial rhetorical devices quiz at the beginning of the year. When we have a parallel structure, so parallel sentences or clauses that showcase opposites or opposition or contrast in some way. So chiasmus is basically when the order of the terms in the first clause is simply reversed in the second. Okay, so two different ideas are conveyed using the same words. So for example, "Never let a fool kiss you," or "a kiss fool you," or "ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." Those are examples of chiasmus because the words are inverted, which results in a completely different meaning, but the structure is parallel. And then antithesis is when there are strong and clear opposites, emphasized again by parallel structure. And the best way to understand this is with an example. "I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a desert state sweltering with the injustice of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice." So in this particular example of antithesis, we have a desert state and oasis as opposites, injustice and freedom, and then oppression and justice. And they are juxtaposed together through this syntax, right? And that's what an antithesis is. And then an imperative sentence. Sentences, we talked about this with Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. Sentences used to command, enjoin, implore, entreat, or beg, or request. So they are things like "do not falter" or "listen to what I say." These were used a lot in the Julius Caesar speeches that you guys read from Brutus and Mark Antony. He starts off with an imperative sentence, "Lend me your ears," right? Listen to me. Inverted syntax is the way that Yoda speaks. The subject and the verb are inversed or reversed. "Whose woods these are, I think I know," instead of "I think I know whose woods these are." The next three models of argument are something you're going to learn about tomorrow. But it's basically three different structures on how to form an argument. We usually use Tolman when we write analysis essays. These are all structures that are familiar to you. You just didn't necessarily know they had specific names. And then the last section of this Quizlet terms are all of the terms from that PowerPoint at the beginning of this unit. Analogy, syllogism, enthymeme, deductive and inductive reasoning. And I gave you guys a little mnemonic because I know I always get these confused regardless of how often I've taught it. Deduction rhymes with reduction. So when we talk about deductive reasoning, you start with a set of ideas and reduce them into smaller, nitty-gritty specific things. And inductive begins with the same letters as increase. So you start with the tiny little nitty-gritty and you branch out and make it bigger. You increase it into the general. Okay. So there are those two. And then, again, these are all the terms from that PowerPoint at the beginning of the year. Like I said, hopefully easily accessible either in important resources module or this week's module.
So are we having like a test or a quiz on these terms, or do you just want us to know them?
This is part 1 of your unit test on Friday. Yeah, and it's matching in multiple choice. Okay, so there's the Quizlet terms review, just so you guys can hear them again. The next thing that I want to go over is basically an introduction to argumentation. We all know how to argue. We just got to hone our skills a little bit. So, my millions of tabs, which one is the right one? All right, so I like to start off this unit with some arguments that are low stakes, non-controversial, and kind of ridiculous, so you guys can see the process of developing a position, and that it's certainly possible to basically turn anything into an argument. We're quite good at it. So the issue is that all of us can respond to an issue or a particular opposition and create an opinion, but we've got to learn how to defend it, right? And so this week we're really focusing on that. So let's say that this was the prompt that we were presented with. Which piece of toast is perfectly toasted? Okay. And we look at it, and we have our own, it sounds ridiculous, but our own prejudices that we bring to the table, our own experiences, and our own definitions of what it means to have a piece of toast, right? But our job is to articulate and prove to our opponent or our audience that we are correct. That, for example, for me, number 11 is the best example of a perfectly toasted piece of bread. So I have to think about the definition of perfect in this context. And then I have to prove to my audience that number 11 fits that criteria, right? And so we may be able to right off the bat decide which of those looks the most appealing to us, but we've got to prove to our audience why it's the most appealing. So perfectly toasted toast should have a balanced amount of color on the surface, a golden brown color, and a soft bread-like center. It should not be black and carbonous, okay? Because it has the most balanced ratio of bread to toasted surface and is well toasted while still maintaining the integrity of the bread, number 11 is the most perfectly toasted toast pictured here. That's my assertion. I've set up the criteria, and I've outlined what my evidence would be in my essay. Now, yes, I know it's ridiculous to imagine writing an essay about this, but I guarantee you all of you could do it, right? And then I go in and I contest my potential opponents who maybe think that for whatever reason, for some god-awful reason, that number 1 is the best. I'm ready for that. I'm already going to refute you. I'm going to say numbers 1, 2, 5, 6, and 9 are way too toasted. The bread surface is destroyed due to burning, and it's no longer bread, right? And if you think that the middle of the road ones, like 3 and 4 and 6, 7, 8, 10, 13, 14, and 15, are right, you're wrong, because they're too uneven and splotchy in their coloring. So they obviously were not evenly toasted. So therefore, they don't fit the criteria of perfectly toasted, right? The taste would be thrown off. The texture would be thrown off. It would be a mess. right? So at the heart of this, I've started with what's called a claim of definition, right? Remember those 4 types of claim that we make in arguments? And I've defined what it means to have a perfect piece of toast. And then I've articulated why my opinion, number 11, fits that measure or fits that definition, right? So that's what you're doing in argument. Sometimes you're making a claim of definition, okay, and that's developing a position. Prompt number 2 is more conceptual. Okay, so we're not dealing with a physical, tangible object and trying to define it. We are making a moral argument. Settle the debate. Should the person sitting in the middle seat on an airplane get both armrests? Right? We could consider a variety of angles. All of them are claims of value about how things should be, right? We could take the equity, equality, democratic values mindset and say that our culture really celebrates equal, right? That's a thing that we love and value here. So of course we would want to make sure that our comfort level on an airplane is equal and equitable. We could take the morality route and consider that a good person is selfless and cares about the comfort of others. We could take the individualist route and say that it's the luck of the draw, and sometimes we get middle seats and sometimes we get window and aisle, and you just have to deal with the punches. And we could use anecdotes, hypotheticals, quotes, readings that we've read. We could use rhetorical appeals to prove our claim, to develop our position, right? I was supposed to say prompt 3. I actually deleted what was prompt 3 because it was dumb. This one, again, these seem really dumb, but what I'm trying to get you to see is like the crux of argumentation is boiling down an issue to its very basic parts, right? So how would a bear or a cat or a dog or whatever wear pants, right? First, you have to determine which of them looks the least weird, and you start there. Right, so I automatically gravitate to option B, and I'm thinking, okay, I'm probably going to argue that option B is the best, but I got to make sure I cover all my bases, right? I got to have evidence. Second, I have to define the function of pants. What purpose are they supposed to serve? Is it to cover the lower half of the body, in which case both of them meet that criteria? Is it to cover the lower half of the body but also allow for mobility and functionality? Then perhaps option B is the best? Or is it to just cover all of the legs that a creature may have, in which case option A is the correct answer? To control the weight of the abdomen and provide support for the lumbar region? Maybe, so then B is best. Are the front paws of a bear his legs too? If they're not, then maybe option B, but if they are, then option A, right? You have to define the criteria before you can argue that one is correct or incorrect. Right? Now, these are obviously not prompts that you're going to be presented with in like a serious format, right? We use them as sort of drills to practice the skill, but what you will be presented with are prompts like this. Okay? And this is from the 2015 exam. And it was a notoriously difficult one for students because they didn't have any buy-in. They didn't really have any strong opinions about the issue that they were asked to argue. And so the scores seemed low because there was not a lot of investment. But here's where you just got to fake it till you make it and pretend you care, right? You hypothetically put yourself in a situation in which you care greatly about, in this case, the value and function of polite speech. So, an anthropologist studying first-year students at a university in the United States writes that friendly phrases like, "How are you?" "Nice to meet you," and "Let's get in touch" communicate politeness rather than literal intent. What, if anything, is the value or function of such polite speech? In an argument prompt, the Q3, it's just like the Q2. You're given background information before you're given your task. So you got to read all of it. Your task in this case for the students in 2015, develop your position on the value or function of polite speech in a culture or community with which you are familiar. Use appropriate evidence from your reading experience or observations to support your argument. You can see why kids struggled with this. It's not like an issue that's at the forefront of your day-to-day life. And the open argument prompts on AP Lang are intentionally non-controversial and non-political. I'm going to say that again. They are never going to deal with controversial or political issues. They're not going to be dealing with the issue like civil rights or justice. They're not going to be dealing with government overreach. It's all going to be not innocuous topics, but topics where there are a wide range of opinions that are acceptable and right, so that you can actually prove, right? And so that your readers are not biased in their reading of your essay, okay? So that's from 2015. The 2018 prompt asked a rather philosophical argument. Consider the value Lindbergh, this author, places on choosing the unknown, and then develop your own position on the value of exploring the unknown. If you look at the setup of this prompt, it's exactly like our assertion journals. Okay, you're given a quote that articulates an assertion, and then you're asked to develop your own opinion, your own position. We tracking so far? I see a lot of you looking elsewhere.
I've been listening, but I also did go get water, so I know what's going on. I'm also reading because I understand this, and I do it really well in my own time, so I'm just going to keep it real with you.
Oh, babes, famous last words. Okay.
I have an A in this class, so I'd say that's pretty good.
Yeah, that means that you don't have to care anymore.
No, I care.
Okay.
Don't worry.
Well, just know, like, I don't go over this instruction again. You get it once. Because we go for a semester break after this. So, I think that's kind of it. Okay. There's not a prompt from last year because they didn't have to write an argument prompt because of the craziness that had just happened in March. But this is the most recent one. So this one asks, basically, for you to articulate the extent to which a concept, place, or role is overrated. That was it. It was that open. Describe something that you think is overrated and explain your judgment. Explain why you think it's overrated. Right? A lot of kids wrote about how the College Board is overrated, which is honestly a valid argument, but they didn't, some of them did it really well and scored really high, and then some of them, it ended up just being like this long-winded rant instead of an argument. A rant is not an argument. A rant is a rant, right? And the key is using evidence to support your claims, paying homage to your opponents, using a tone that is approachable, understanding the purpose and audience that you have, right? Argument is not about forming opinions. Argument is rhetoric.
What do you do when you see a hole in your own argument?
You patch it. So what do you mean by a hole in your own argument? Like, you know that maybe your logic is flawed or something?
Like, yeah, or I can see the other side just completely blowing my side down. Like I have a bad idea thing of like where I can see how my argument is like invalid, and I find it hard to keep going after I realize that.
It's not a bad thing for you to be aware of where your argument is weak. That just means that you need to be able to refute what your opponent might say. So let's say that, like, arguing about the toast thing, like, if I knew, actually, let's choose the airplane one. Like, I'm arguing the selflessness and care, and that the primary thing that we should be concerned about is the care and comfort of others. And I know that that's a weak argument for people who don't care about others, right?
Yeah.
Or who are more concerned with their own comfort. So I'm going to automatically think about, for example, the opposing argument, which is luck of the draw, you get what you get, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to come up with hypotheticals or anecdotes or emotional appeals that are automatically going to make my opponent reconsider. Yes, there may be a hole in my argument, but also perhaps there's a hole in yours, right?
And since this is rhetoric, we're not allowed to use first person, so you can't bring up like past evidence of stuff you've done before to prove it.
You can use first person, you just should avoid second person. And so first person is like I, we, us. That's super actually strategic in rhetoric. But the only time you use you are in very rare occasions when you're trying to say put the audience in a particular situation. Like, let's say you were like, imagine you were in an airport and you paid the same amount of money for your ticket as the bimbo sitting on your left, right? Like, you should have the same number of armrests as she does, right? That's when you can use you.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah. You just want to avoid saying I believe and I think over and over again. You want to be sparing your use of that.
All right, sick. Thank you.
You're welcome. So, yeah, that's the most recent argument prompt we have. And that one was kind of out of left field, to be quite honest with you. That was the first of its kind where they just literally had you talk about what it means for something to be overrated. But you can see that there's a wide range of types, and we'll look at more throughout next semester as well, so we can familiarize ourselves with the task. Now, what time is it? Perfect. The other thing I like to show you is I want to bring back claim, evidence, and reasoning, okay? So I don't know if you talked about this in your sophomore classes, maybe, maybe not. But essentially, when we're articulating an argument, we're articulating a claim, we're backing it up with evidence, and then we are using reasoning to convince our audience, right? And so I have linked this particular resource for you so you can see these are lyrics from the 2 cabinet battles from the play Hamilton, where they use claim, evidence, and reasoning about very specific issues. So it's very clear and like a clear-cut claim, evidence, and reasoning setup. And so the issue on the table for the first one is whether or not the United States should adapt Secretary Hamilton's plan to assume states' debts by establishing a national bank. And Jefferson presents his case and his claim, evidence, and reasoning. And then Hamilton presents his and actually ends up using a lot of what are called ad hominem attacks rather than actual evidence and reasoning to support his claim. So we see what happens when you have a rant from Hamilton and a reasoned argument from Jefferson. Okay. Now, Jefferson's argument has a lot of holes in it as well, but Stephen, this kind of speaks to addressing holes in arguments. I've highlighted it for you so you can look at this, but claim is red, evidence is blue, and reasoning is green. And Jefferson's claim, his response to this issue, his position that he's developing, is that Hamilton forgets that his plan would actually have the government assume debt rather than eliminate it. And that would benefit the Treasury Department, but it would not benefit any other department. It would not benefit the people. That's the crux of his argument. And he proves it with the fact that the South doesn't have any debts because they use slave labor, and that they are basically living in luxury. So why should they assume debt from another part of the country? And he reasons, his green reasoning is that if we want to really be free, if we really believe in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that we just fought for, then we should say no to this tyrannical suggestion of a national bank, right? And he ends his argument there. Pretty well structured, actually very logical. He appeals to emotions, right, of patriotism and freedom and liberty. And he does a decent job of not attacking Hamilton, but attacking his plan. And then we look at Hamilton's response, and it is actually pretty much chock full of attacks on Jefferson rather than Jefferson's argument. But his claim is if we assume debts, the Union gets like a financial boost, right? The economy is potentially saved in the long term, even though we adopt more debt in the short term. And then he supports this by poking a hole in Jefferson's argument, which is basically you have no debt because you don't pay for labor. So you cannot use that as a support for your argument because slavery is immoral, and therefore your argument would be immoral. And then his reasoning is not real reasoning. It's an ad hominem attack, right? So he says, you're not allowed to talk about fighting in a war because you didn't fight in the war. You were off with the French and living in luxury. And as he says, getting high with the French instead of actually fighting for liberty, okay? So this is what it looks like when we have a position developed, not just an opinion, not just a statement of what you think or want your audience to think, but an actual position with reasoned evidence, okay? And then here is the next or the last thing that I want us to do today. And this is basically where you try your hand at the initial process of developing a position. Okay, and I'm going to try to use that terminology often because when we hear argument, we think of things like we think of forming opinions, but what we're actually doing is developing a position. So if you guys go to today's tasks on Canvas, and you go to task 2, so it's 12-7 and 12-8 synchronous. Task 2. There is a link to a document called Treat Yourself. It's because it's self-guided, like practice with argument. And if you click the link, it automatically will open up a page for you to make a copy of that document. So I want you to do that. Put your name in the title, so it's yours. And what you'll end up seeing once you've got that copy made is a document that looks like this. This step 1 is kind of what giving you some tools to accomplish what we just talked about, right? The value of forming evidence and a claim that is defensible, that it's arguable. And it all boils down to having a cultural literacy that is broad and deep, that you have a base of knowledge with which to pull from in order to support your claims from a variety of different elements of society. We will talk more about that in a practical sense later this week. But it just makes some suggestions, right? So watch the news each week, read a few news articles or editorials. Don't just read the headlines, because that doesn't tell the whole story. And in order to be reasoned rhetoricians, we have to know the whole story. When watching a movie or TV show, you should be thinking about what argument is being made. So what is this movie trying to teach me? What is this TV show's like episode's lesson that I'm supposed to be left with? Do I agree with it and why? Or do I disagree with it and how can I disprove it? Right? In history or in your Gov class, right? Be thinking about events' relevance to today's challenges or occurrences. And I know that your Gov class does a really good job of you making connections between current events and issues that have been plaguing us from the beginning. So those of you who've taken AP US and AP Gov are in a really good spot because obviously those AP curricula overlap. And so we're all hoping that you're making connections and being able to form arguments and develop positions according to the information that we're presented with. And then obviously when you listen to music or watch comedic performances, those people are making arguments. What arguments are they making, and where do you fall on the issues that they're presenting? And place yourself in opposition with them and determine where you fall, right? This next part walks you through the process of answering a prompt and determining what the issue is at stake and being able to give credit to both sides, okay? So let's say you were presented with this particular prompt, which asks you to take a position on the value of public statements of opinion and then wants you to support your view with appropriate evidence, okay? So in public statements of opinion from television shows, talk radio, web blogs, citizens, politicians, entertainers, what is the value of those public statements of opinion? Are they worthwhile? Do they foster democratic values or do they not? Okay. So when you read a prompt like this or you're presented with an issue, your first level of, honing your ideas and being able to articulate a position is to determine the issue or subject at hand. And in this case, it's public opinion. Your next level is to examine both sides. You have to look at both sides before you can determine the validity of your own argument, okay? Define the defend or pro or affirmative side of the issue and then define the opposite side. And then think of examples that would support either side of the issue. So for example, in this particular case, the defend or the pro or affirmative side of this prompt is that public opinions are worthwhile and foster democratic values. And the challenge or the anti or the negative is that they are bogus and are anything but democratic. Okay? And now we know very clearly what two sides are at stake, so we can place ourselves on the spectrum there. Are we also under the pro? Are we under the challenge? Or do we fall somewhere in the middle where we want to qualify and give some specific instances in which public opinion is good and which public opinion is bad? And this is where you would put examples or potential evidence. Okay. So that's the first major step, is basically articulating your claim and forming evidence. So that's what step 2 asks you to do. Okay. I've given you a sample prompt from a previously released exam, and I have given you what the topic or issue is, and I've given you evidence for both sides of the issue. What I want you to do is write your assertion or your claim in response to the prompt. The nice thing about Q3, right, the nice thing about argument, there is not a précis that you have to follow. You have to articulate what your claim is in whatever way you feel is most effective and most clear. So that is what I would like you to spend the remaining time doing, is step 2 on this document. As long as you get it, excuse me, submitted before 11:59 p.m. tonight, you're good. I just want to see that you're tracking with this particular task, the argument task, and it is a completion grade. So have that date.
So we don't have to do the step 1.
Correct. Step 1 was just instruction and notes, I guess, for you.